It's thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I just came in from New York City, and it's maybe 28 degrees there. And I just wanted to say before I go any further that the cold weather builds character. I don't know you guys have all forgotten that, but you are lesser people for being out here. This is what we tell ourselves in New York. So I wanted to talk about a puzzle. It's a puzzle that I came across when I was writing my book, David and Goliath, and which I think is really relevant to this topic of transformation, about what it means to transform and what it takes to transform an institution or a business or an individual. And the puzzle is what I call the weapons of the spirit problem. And it's one I think we need to understand and deal with if we're going to tackle these questions of transformation. And I think it applies in a number of different areas, but I thought I would start with a story from the military. In the 1960s, in the beginning of the 1960s, the Pentagon got together a panel of eminent historians and asked them to look at several hundred years of battles between very, very powerful countries and very, very small countries. They were about to enter into the Vietnam War, and they wanted to get some sense of how those kinds of conflicts worked. How did they tend to turn out? And what were the conditions and factors that determined the course of those kinds of asymmetrical conflicts? So the historians went off for several years, and they came back and they issued a report called the Oregon Trail Project. And it filled 7 volumes. And their conclusion was that these kinds of battles between very large countries and very small ones turned ultimately on psychological and not military factors. The battle was not won by the country with the most troops and the most guns and the most money. It was won by the country that wanted to fight the hardest and longest, that cared the most, that was willing to persevere, right? And if the large country neglected this fact and relied entirely on military operations, they would lose. Now, this has subsequently been confirmed by all manner of studies that have looked at, some historians and political scientists have done these databases of battles between countries where one country is at least 10 times the size of the other. And what they discover is that if the little country in that kind of conflict decides to fight unconventionally, to use guerrilla warfare, to rely on perseverance and discipline and guts, they will win 64% of the time, right? That's astonishing. You look at, that's a database based on hundreds of conflicts over the last several hundred years. I would point out, because I'm Canadian, I don't know if you know this, I'm Canadian, Canada is 1/10 the size of the United States. So if you guys invade us and we choose to fight unconventionally, we'll win. Or at least the odds are, just keep that in mind. Unless you get a little bit rebellious over the next. In other words, what's in here, what's in your heart, is much more important than what's in your hand when it comes to fighting a battle. Now, I don't think this should be a surprise, because we see the same pattern in all kinds of walks of life. Let me give you another example. I don't know how many of you are football fans. I'm a big football fan. This next little section's only relevant if you are a football fan. But you know, before any quarterback is drafted into the NFL, he's given what's called the Wonderlic Test. It's an IQ test. And it's not the same IQ test we all took when we were young. It's for football players, but it's a little bit shorter. But still, it's doing the same general thing. And the reason we give it to quarterbacks is that people think that your intelligence is a reasonable predictor of how well you will play that position in the National Football League, right? Because playing quarterback is incredibly cognitively complex. You have to master a huge number of plays, and you do all kinds of, so they think, look, it's important to know someone's IQ if you want to know whether they're going to be a good NFL quarterback. All right, so what is the correlation between IQ, high IQ, and success at playing quarterback? It's a very good question. Well, I'm just going to read you a list of the 5 quarterbacks who have scored among the lowest scores ever recorded on the Wonderlic. The Wonderlic is out of 50. All of these guys scored less than 20. You get 15 points for signing your name, just to put this in perspective. Okay, so these are the 5 lowest scores of all time. Randall Cunningham, Donovan McNabb, Jim Kelly, Dan Marino, and Terry Bradshaw. Now, I have, for those of you who are not football fans, I've just named 5 of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. Now, does this mean that being smart is irrelevant for playing quarterback? No, of course not, because I can also give you names of quarterbacks who have scored really well and who are really brilliant. Peyton Manning scored really high. So did Tom Brady. I mean, there's Aaron Rodgers. These are all guys who scored at the upper end. And each one of those cases, it's clearly relevant. If you are someone of advanced intelligence, it helps you on the football field. But what do those 5 names say? They say that there are other things more important than intelligence. That courage and resilience and leadership and effort are all things that ultimately account for more than the number of IQ points that you have, right? You know, if I went around this room and I asked every one of you to account for why you've achieved what you've achieved in this world, I am quite convinced that not a single one of you would name your SAT score as a reason why you've done what you've done, right? No, you would come back and you would say, no, it's because of things that are in my heart. That's why I've been able to do what I've succeeded at doing. And then, of course, there's the story I'm going to talk about in much more detail this evening, the story that served as the inspiration for my last book, the story of David and Goliath, right? Goliath is the mightiest warrior in all of Palestine, but David fells him with one shot from his sling. And why does David do it? Why is he capable of winning this extraordinary victory? Well, first of all, because he has the imagination to understand that he can bring a sling to a sword fight, right? It occurred to no one else. 2, he has the courage. He's the only guy on the Israelite side who isn't terrified of this enormous giant. And thirdly, and most importantly, because he has the Spirit of the Lord in his heart. He's got faith, right? And the combination of imagination, courage, and faith make him the mightiest warrior on the battlefield. Make him an unstoppable force, right? All of these examples I've given you are examples of the extraordinary power of the weapons of the Spirit. So here's the puzzle. If weapons of the Spirit are so crucial in winning battles, in felling giants, in playing quarterback position well, why do we dismiss them so easily? Because we do. What did the Pentagon do after they got that 6-volume report saying that what really matters in winning battles is what's in here? They ignored everything it said and went and tried to fight a battle in Vietnam based just on the number of troops they had and the number of planes they were flying in the air, right? What happens today when you go to the NFL at draft time? Well, all of the general managers pay extraordinary attention to the score of the quarterbacks they're drafting on the Wonderlic Test, even though 5 of the greatest quarterbacks of all time barely scored above signing your name on that particular test, right? And even though each one of you would say that your SAT score or the college you attended or your IQ score is not really what made a difference in the success you've achieved in the world, if I gathered together a group of 18-year-olds right now, all graduating from high school, and asked them, what do you think is the most important determinant of future success? What would they say? They would say the college I'm going to attend, right? Whether I get into a good college or not. Right? As if all of the examples of all around them mean nothing, account for nothing. And then there's David, you know. David has the imagination to change the rules, the courage that no one else has, and the Spirit of the Lord in his heart, and yet we persist in calling him an underdog. This is what I'm going to talk about later tonight. Why is he the underdog if he has the weapons of the Spirit on his side? There's that lovely verse in 1 Samuel 16, which I use as the beginning quotation in my book. Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. There is a reason that verse says what it does, and that is because we make that mistake all the time. It's telling us you make this big error when you make sense of the world. You look on outward appearance, you look on the size of someone's stature, and you forget what's in the heart. Right? That's what really matters. Now, is this a trivial problem? Is this something that, no, I think it's actually an incredibly crucial problem that profoundly changes the way we behave in the world and causes us to make enormous mistakes. And let me give you an example, and this is one that I was floored by when I was doing my book. It's a story I tell at the very end about this village in France called Le Chambon, about what happened in this little village in the Second World War. Some of you will know this story. It's a famous story of the Second World War. But during the Second World War, after the Germans invade France, the French set up this puppet dictatorship called Vichy, right? Which basically is a government which does everything the Nazis tell them to do. And Vichy behaves abominably over the course of the war while they're occupied by the Germans. They pass all kinds of laws against Jews. They ban Jews from professions. They help the Germans round up Jews. They pass all of these incredibly oppressive laws. And one of the things they say is that every morning French school children have to give the full fascist salute to the flag, right, before the school starts. And everyone in France, after Vichy passes this law, starts to do this. Everyone, that is, except the residents of this little town called Le Chambon, which is in the southeast corner of France, up in the mountains, in a place called the Vivarais Plateau. And what's peculiar about this town is that it is a town that is made up almost entirely of Huguenots, that dissident Protestant sect that had been in France for several hundred years. And their local pastor was a guy named André Tracmy, and he's this big, lumbering, complicated man. And on the Sunday after France falls to the Germans, he gives this sermon in which he says, we're going to obey the law as we are obliged to do as Christians, but if it conflicts with the lessons of the gospel, we're going to say no. We're going to go our own way. So after that law is passed, which says that the children have to salute the flag with the full fascist salute, Tracmy says, we're not going to do it. That's contrary to our beliefs. And then the Vichy passes a law which says that all teachers have to sign an oath to the state. And Tracmy says, we can't do that. We don't believe in this state. And then Vichy, on the first anniversary of the fall of France, says that every bell in every town square has to ring in celebration of this momentous occasion of France falling to the Nazis. And Tracmy says, we're not ringing the bell. And when people show up and say, why aren't you ringing the bell? One of Tracmy's people turns to them and says, we only ring the bell for God. We don't ring it for Vichy. And finally, word gets out around France about what they're up to, and Jews who are being persecuted realize this is a safe haven. And they start to trickle up the mountain to Le Chambon, and the villagers take them in and take many of them across the border into Switzerland. And by the end of the war, several thousand Jews are saved from the Nazis because of the effort of this village. There's this incredible story which I tell in the book, which it's about a time in 1942 when one of the Vichy ministers came on a state visit to Le Chambon. He wanted to set up the equivalent of youth camps, Nazi youth camps throughout France. And there's this guy named Georges Lamarand, and he was came with a big entourage. He was wearing some fantastic blue uniform, and he has a whole itinerary for his day. He's going to have a banquet, and then he's going to have a march through the town, then he's going to have a big ceremony with all the townsfolk. And it's a disaster. During the banquet, they serve him terrible food, and then one of Tracmy's daughters accidentally spills soup down the front of his uniform. And then on the big march through the town, no one shows up. And then he gets to the reception, and a bunch of kids give him a letter. And the letter is all about something that had just happened in Paris, which is that the French police had assisted the Nazis in rounding up 12,000 Jews. And they held them in a place called the Veldiv. And from there, they were deported to Auschwitz. It's one of the most shameful episodes in France during the war. And the kids, these are kids, they give them this letter. And I'm going to read the letter to you. They hand it to this minister of Vichy, France. And it says, Mr. Minister, we have learned of the frightening scenes which took place 3 weeks ago in Paris, where the French police, on orders of the occupying power, arrested in their homes all the Jewish families in Paris. The fathers were torn from their families and sent to Germany, the children torn from their mothers. We are afraid that the same measures of deportation of the Jews will soon be applied in the southern zone, which is where Le Chambon was. And this is my favorite part of the letter. We feel obliged to tell you that there are among us a certain number of Jews, but we make no distinction between Jews and non-Jews. It is contrary to the gospel teaching. If our comrades, whose only fault is to be born in another religion, receive the order to let themselves be deported or even examined, they would disobey the order received, and we would try to hide them as best we could. A bunch of kids stand up in front of the official of the Vichy government, the government representing the Nazi regime, and basically say, we have Jews here, you're not getting them. Right? Now, that's an extraordinary thing. This is 1942. They are standing up to the Nazis. And what is everything we know about the Nazis at that point? That the Nazis are just about the most ruthless army that anyone has ever seen. They have shown on numerous occasions that when people defy them, they simply murder them. And yet here is this little town who have the courage to stand up to the Nazis and say, we're not playing along. Now, where does that come from, that courage? Well, the answer is that the Huguenots of Le Chambon had an extraordinary past. They had been persecuted for 200 years in the 17th and 18th century. Their members had been rounded up and the pastors had been executed and their children had been taken from them. Their wives had been locked up in prison. Their religion had been banned. They had been driven underground. They had been subjected to just about the most horrendous series of oppression that any group had ever been subjected to. And what had they learned? They had learned that even in the face of that kind of extraordinary hardship, their God had protected them. They had survived. Some of them had died, they had suffered, they had been driven underground, they had been forced to flee to Switzerland, but they were still around. They'd made it. They had discovered that faced with just about the most horrendous kind of oppression, if you lived by your wits and you had faith in your God and you believed in the weapons of the Spirit, you would be fine. So they looked at the Nazis and they said, we've been through this before, right? These guys can't scare us. There's an incredible quote from Andrei Trocmé's wife. She says that when the first Jewish refugees showed up at their door in the winter of 1941, knocking on the door, and she opened the door and said, of course, come in. And she said later that it never even occurred to her to say no. And she said, I did not think that it would be dangerous. Nobody thought of that. That's a measure of how extraordinary these people were. It didn't even occur to them to think that by taking in Jews in 1941, they were putting themselves at risk. Now, here's the incredible thing, though. The Huguenots are not the only committed Christians in France in 1941. There are millions of Christians in France in 1941 who worship exactly the same God, who sing the same hymns, who read the same Bible, who are in every way indistinguishable from the Huguenots. But those people don't take in Jews. Those people don't defy the Vichy regime. And why not? Because those Christians didn't realize just how powerful their faith made them. They didn't understand just how extraordinarily important and powerful the weapons of the Spirit really are. They made the mistake that I think we all make when it comes to making sense of the world we live in, which is we underestimate just how incredibly transformative this is, the stuff in our hearts. So that's my very simple lesson to all of you when you think about what it means to transform a business. And that is that transforming a business is no different from any other kind of transformation. And that is, it's not about what's number of IQ points in your head. It's not about what you hold in your hand. It's not about how much money there is in your wallet. It's about here, right? It's about whether you understand just how extraordinarily powerful the kinds of things that reside in our heart really are. Thank you.